I was told by technical people I really couldn't refer to this as a river, so I had to take the word river out of the paper that you haven't seen yet, but I couldn't take it out of the cover. But in my mind, it's still, in very loose terms, a river. The GAB, for those that aren't familiar with it, covers about 22% of Australia, or underlies 22%. It holds, at the current estimate, about 65,000 million megalitres of water. And we've put a DVD out that explains the GAB in a more graphical form, and I've extracted and stolen a few stills from that as we go through. But in that, you'll find that equates to about putting 0.5 metre of water over the land mass of the world. Just to put it in perspective, that's the sort of quantum of water we're talking about. Since the first bore went down near Burke in New South Wales in 1878, we've lost over 1,000 of the springs that were supported by the extraction from those bores. A lot of the bores that were originally artesian, flowing to the surface naturally, have since ceased to flow. But from an economic point of view, the GAB area supports the production of about $3.5 billion worth per annum. Going back in history, we're talking about that sort of time frame when Australia broke away, and the part to watch there, this is taken out of the DVD, is that big depression in that you see in Australia as it's separating from the other continents 250 million years ago. With the changes of the ice age melts and previous climate change, I guess, water was captured in the basin, and the waters receded and was held in the aquifers underneath. So this is where I guess I'm relating to the GAB. In the ancient system is really a wide series of rivers which carried with them the silt, clay, sands and gravel. Then it changed, dried up, land changed formations. The sandstone became sealed in a whole series of different depths of aquifers. And in cross-section, and again this is taken out of the video, which is a cute animated version, basically what we have is that very small amount of water recharges those aquifers. The water of the rain that falls on the Great Dividing Range, for example, which is where most of the recharge areas are, find their way down into the aquifers and come out as far away as South Australia and close to Alice Springs in Mound Springs. They're quite in very general terms. So under that sort of pressure, when we drill a bore, if it is still pressurised to that extent, it pops up and serves stock and domestic and the mining and petroleum industry. That's again another view, just highlighting where the relatively small area of the intake beds are in red. It's not quite correct up in the top end of Australia. Our experts tell us in actual fact that the boundary isn't the land masses shown there. So when you do get a chance to see the DVD, just remember that in actual fact it goes in under the sea up there. So fishermen actually can have related stories of fresh water actually coming bubbling up out of the aquifer itself. But of course, that's not just one basin, it's a whole series of separate basins. There's a three-dimensional model, and again, the flow pattern shown on that is my very loose reference to it actually flowing as a river or a series of rivers. The tests that have been done suggest that the oldest water in the GAB is something like 2 million years old as it travels generally from east to west. Very slow rate of movement. So I'm saying it's probably the slowest, hottest, deepest and pressurised river that we'll come across. In some parts, especially in central Queensland, when you drill down 3 kilometres in that particular case, the water can come up at 100 degrees Celsius. So in the paper I've alluded to a power generation plant that is set up at Birdsville, for example, and that's right out in the middle of nowhere. But it is actually an attempt to, and it does generate power just basically on the hot pressurised water that comes up. And again, at the extreme, when it gets to the surface, it can reach a height of 130 metres. Where I come from in Walgett, in New South Wales, we access the aquifer at a depth of 650 metres. And the water, when it comes to the surface, it does reach the surface, not a very high pressure, but it's about 43 degrees. So that's the sort of range that you're expecting across the basin. Basically, this is the sort of problem that my Great Artesian Basin Coordinating Committee has set out to try and address. We're looking in this term of something like 90% of the water that reaches the surface is wasted. And in the paper I allude to, when you consider that the first bore went down in 1878, we're talking about a relatively small time frame of 130 odd years since it was drilled. Since then, the whole landscape has been peppered with bores accessing this to make life livable and bearable and productive in west of the Great Divide, because water is surface water is such a scarce resource. I've estimated that something like about 87 million megalitres has been lost since they've been drilled, and remember that's out of the total current estimate of 65,000 million megalitres. So it's still a relatively small percentage, but when you look at it in terms of up to 90% being wasted, that's been unacceptable for that period, and it's taken some years for the governments to get together to try and address it. So our committee has looked at a number of reports, and at this stage I'd report to you that one study has indicated that what the water that reaches the surface at the moment is contributing something like 330,000 tonne of greenhouse gas emissions by way of CO2 and other equivalents. Something like 200,000 tonne of salt coming to the surface. A lot of that's in the Murray-Darling. So it gets the Murray-Darling people to listen when you talk in terms of that sort of tonnage. And 390-odd thousand megalitres wasted each year. That's what we're trying to address. You sink the bore, it pops up, and in most cases runs down open bore drains for hundreds of kilometres in many cases. There are some places in Queensland where the soil that it discharges to is very sandy, so you don't get the long open bore drains, but you get a big puddle of water that is just evaporating and soaking back into the ground. Some of the other issues we get that we haven't got a handle on yet is the inter-aquifer leakage from a lot of the old bore casings that are starting to deteriorate. So under pressure, we suspect, but we haven't got a handle on, losses also underground going to other aquifers and contaminating other aquifers, or just being lost to the system. So that's the issue that the committee's been looking at addressing. Just in very simple terms, the physical approach has been to put a lot of money into capping and piping programs in all 4 states that it overlaps. And that just basically means closing off an existing bore or bores, drilling a new one, properly lined, or hopefully the construction standards will overcome the problems that we've experienced before, and actually laying polythene pipe for hundreds of kilometres in some cases to replace those open drains. This particular picture is a very simplistic view. Most of them have a reservoir that it would go into first, with then possibly a series of pumps where property owners need the pressure at the other end. And the reservoir is mainly to give the opportunity to cool some of those waters down before pumping it through polythene pipe. As you'd appreciate, there's a limit to the temperature that polythene pipe can handle. Certainly can't handle 100 degrees Celsius, but when you're looking at my area of about 43, degrees C. You still need to cool it down before you send it onwards. I've had one case in my area, Lanillo, near Lightning Ridge, the opal mining town, that survives entirely on bore water. It's used by the town, it's used by the graziers, it's used by the mining industry for puddling, where very early in the piece, the two bores that were flowing were replaced with a system. Pumps were put in to make sure that it reached the 160 kilometres down the far end, where the property owners traditionally had run out of water in summer through the open bore drains. He now gets the water, but what we've found is that the pressure has recovered now that the bank of pumps that were put in are no longer needed. The pressure has recovered such that it's still, through the poly pipe, goes all the way to the end. As at the moment, the committee's been working on a 15-year plan that we put to the government in 5-year lots. The government would only fund the first 5 years, and then we had to prove that it was beneficial, both to the public purse and also not just to landowners. And we had to argue pretty well for that after doing the first 5-year review. The federal government had put in $32 million to be matched by the states and then to be topped up by landholders. So in rough terms, the total sort of figures we look at is about a third from the feds, a third from the states, and a third, not forgetting the property owners that actually have to run with it. We were successful with the second round of funding, and we're halfway through that now. The federal government topped it up with another $42 million. So 42 times 2 from the states and then add another 42. It's adding up. And before Malcolm Turnbull left, who ended up being Minister for Water at the time, he was so convinced that it wasn't necessary to do a further review. He just asked how much would it take to finish off the 15-year program. So in 5 minutes' notice, the government bureaucrats gave him a figure of $85 million, and he said, "You've got the third stage, here's an extra $85 million. Are there any federal people that report to Penny Wong here that now that she's in, she hasn't made any moves to change that position? It's still gobbled up and being... So we have every expectation that the 15-year program will go to its end. So when you add the federal component, the states component, and the landholders component, that's where I'm saying the total cost of this entire cap and pipe physical program is about $450 million over a 15-year program. And that's a very simple view of what it looks like. The sorts of benefits we get from it is right down the far end of the scale. That's a well-used slide that I've taken the liberty of using. And most of the slides I've knocked off from the other, any one of the 19 members of the GAB committee in the different fields. These are the sort of springs, the mound springs they're referred to in South Australia. You've got Blanche Cap and the other one escapes me at the moment, but the one in the back is a mound spring as well. Here I am pointing to the screen. You can't see where I'm pointing, but just use your imagination. Think of on the horizon there is also a mound spring. It's from millions of years of water bobbing to the surface, taking the sediments, and it's just continually growing. There have been quite a number of springs, as I said earlier in the piece, that have ceased to flow. The program is to try and also recover that. And for the overseas visitors, of course, these sorts of springs were the lifeblood of our indigenous population and our early explorers as they went through Central Australia. I've thrown this one in too, just to give an indication of a typical sort of cross-section where the blue is highlighting the various GAB aquifers at the various levels. As you'd appreciate, it's not just one body of water, there's a range of them. Not all these aquifers cover the entire basin. There's different aquifers in different sub-catchments, you might say, across that big picture. But I throw that in because of the current Australia's boom in mining, where we used to pepper the countryside with deep drilling down to the Artesian Basin. What we're now finding is a lot of exploratory bores for coal and the petroleum industry as well, and our committee does not have a handle on what that is going to do to GAB. A lot of the lower GAB aquifers aren't, according to this, affected, but you'll see there's a reference to Walloon coal measures, for example. I've used this one just to demonstrate that it does actually underlie some of the GAB aquifers. So to drill down to prove that and extract it is actually going through some of the GAB water. So we have a concern, but we don't have an idea of what level of concern we should have. There's the other effects on the environment that I like is this one that was stolen from a ABC landline. Like this, the sound on it is just the person demonstrating that, wow, that's a lot of kangaroos. And when I first saw it, I thought Jurassic Park, they've digitised one kangaroo and just added a whole stack of them. But in actual fact, that is a real life example of how having all the GAB waters come to the surface over hundreds of kilometres and artificial watering points has allowed our native population, apart from allowing feral pigs and other weeds to proliferate, allowed our own native population to explode in actual fact, and then when we have a long period of drought when there's nothing to eat, they just die by the hundreds, and that's the example that was used in this particular one. So, Tony, if you're happy, I'll draw that to a close there, and again, just say that the papers, I understand, that in full detail will be on the net after the conference, but there is a DVD that the committee is making available free of charge for those that have a further interest in understanding the GAB. So thank you very much.